Okay, could we start by you telling us a little bit about yourself and your experience of managing risk?
Yes, of course. My name's Jeff Brinley. I'm Finance Director of Ensley Insurance Services Limited. I've worked for the company now for 25 years, and for the last 6 years I've been given specific responsibility for the management of risk at a board level.
You've written a guide for students' unions, guilds, associations and councils. Can you tell us what the guide's about and who it's for?
Yes, it's a guide covering the basic principles of risk management and could be used by any organisation in the UK, but has been specifically prepared for officers and employees of the student unions who are responsible for risk.
Okay, so assuming a member of staff or an officer has been given responsibility for managing risk at a student union, what's the basics? Where do they start?
Well, there's a lot of consultants' jargon surrounding this, but basically it's down to 3 things. It's about establishing your objectives, then identifying the risks that might cause you not to achieve those objectives, and then considering what actions you could take to mitigate those risks to give you a better chance of achieving those objectives. And I would say that although you think you know nothing about risk at the moment, you are probably intuitively managing risk in everything you do throughout every day of your life. Probably that's best explained with a simple example, maybe crossing the road. By deciding to cross the road, you've already established your objective. You wish to get to the other side of the road. You've probably also started to consider the risks attached to the achievement of that objective by maybe looking right and seeing a car approaching you. Well, that's clearly a risk to you crossing the road. If the car hits you, you're unlikely to get to the other side. Now you've identified the risk, you've started to consider the controls, your controls. Maybe you've decided to let that car pass. You've maybe even spotted cars behind it that would stop you achieving your objective. So maybe you've extended those controls to looking for a pedestrian crossing.
So managing risk is just about giving yourself a better chance of achieving your goals?
Yes, it's an indisputable fact that the better you manage your risks, the more likely you are to achieve your objectives, whatever they might be. Now, once you've been given responsibility for risk management within an organisation, you can no longer rely on an intuitive approach to risk management. You now have to adopt a much more structured, formal methodology.
Okay, do you have an example of how you can manage risk in a more formal, structured way?
Well, actually, I think it would be useful to run through the way Ensley manages its risks. Now, like any other discipline, there are a number of recognised steps that one has to go through to manage risk. Firstly, we had to decide where risk should be owned within the organisation, and we decided quite early on that risk management was such a fundamental part of the governance of Ensley that it should be owned by the highest level within the organisation. So risk was allocated as a responsibility of the Executive Board of Directors.
So in a student union, this might be the Board of Trustees?
Yes, it would.
Does the board manage risk on a day-to-day basis then?
No, clearly the board can't possibly manage risk on a day-to-day basis. So the way we got around that was to allocate responsibility to a risk committee. And that risk committee is made up of executive directors, non-executive directors and some key colleagues within the organisation. So in the example of a student union, it could comprise of members of the Board of Trustees, student union officers and perhaps staff members.
Where would the risk committee start?
Okay, at our first meeting we had to decide on what type of information we would require to give us the comfort to provide assurance to the board that risk was being properly managed within the organisation.
What did the risk committee decide to share with the board?
Well, firstly, internal and external audit reports, as they provide a valuable insight as to the effectiveness of the controls that exist within the organisation at any one time. Secondly, emerging risks. Emerging risks give us an insight into the risks that the company might face tomorrow or the day after. So they give us some sort of warning about what's coming up next. And in addition, project and one-off risks. These are particularly important because Ensley faces unique risks whenever it tries to introduce change within the organisation through, say, project management, and also the unique risks attached to one-off events. For example, a company conference, or in the example of a student union, maybe the arrangement of a social event.
In the guide, you refer to a risk officer. Can you explain what the role of the risk officer is and how they fit with the committee?
Yeah, well, obviously the risk committee couldn't manage risk on a day-to-day basis, so the way they got around that was to appoint a risk officer. That risk officer had specific responsibility for understanding the objectives of the organisation, to identify the risks to the achievement of those objectives, and to start documenting the controls it had in place to manage those risks. Now, one of the challenges that they faced to begin with was to somehow rank these risks. And clearly any organisation at any point faces many, many risks. Some are hugely important to the success of the organisation, and some, of course, are so immaterial they need no attention at all.